Alright, so I'm going to talk about motivation. And I have a little slideshow prepared. So motivation is a question that I've been thinking about for a long time, and it really revolves around two questions. Why do we do what we do? Why do we think what we think? Now, I'm going to be giving some of my opinions as to the answers of these questions. I don't claim to know the answers. These are just my thoughts as I see them. Yeah. What it all comes down to is I don't think we're that different from any other living thing on Earth. I think in principle and at the core, we're all driven by similar things. And you can see that in videos such as these. Well, you can't really see it, but so here's a neutrophil, a white blood cell, and you see it moving about, and you naturally, as humans do, ask the question, why is it doing this and how is it doing this? And it can lead to some interesting questions around consciousness and free will and what it means to be a living, breathing, thinking thing in this world, and whether this thing is in fact thinking. Is it driven by the same things that we're driven by? Again, it's a question that I often come back to and ask again and again and again. But it's also something that I see in formations such as these. These are famous starling murmurations. And you'll see in a moment how they act similar in many ways to that neutrophil.
Als ik wakker word en er is 12 uur, vliegen bij me
I see a lot of
vandaan.
similarities anyway in the way they move, not necessarily in
Hij
intention.
haalt zich in en ik lig stil.
I can't help but be struck by the pattern and the similarities in
Terwijl ik
the
buiten
same
de
question.
buien
Why is this one doing what it's doing?
overga.
How do they communicate? How do they do all the things that they do?
Gisteravond was evenals voordat ik jou kende los.
But I'll move on now to talk a little bit more about what drives human behavior and human motivations. And there's a number of factors involved. And I'll briefly discuss each one. This is not meant to be a full dive into all the complexity behind motivation and what drives us to do what we do. It's simply my own exploration of this question in a short period of time. So one of the principal drivers is emotion. We are driven towards things that we love or like and away from things that we fear. However, what defines what are the things that we love? How do we come about those, to have those desires or those things that are abhorrent to us? I think, and from what I've seen, it's primarily driven by our languages and our cultures. I see in many different places around the world that they have slightly different understandings of happy, sad, angry, tired. Tired's not an emotion, not in this sense anyways, but there are slightly different tics that triggers emotions in different people. And this was wonderfully exemplified by this book, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. I'd highly recommend it for anybody who wants to dive a little bit deeper into where emotions come from and the role they play in driving us to do all that we do. Another critical aspect, although you can argue that this is tied to emotion, but I think of it as almost a separate thing, is where we seek to get approval from. You know, humans and life in general want to be part of a group. This is not the case for all life, but for most of life, they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They feel safe in a collective. And humans, we seek approval through defining our values. A group has shared values, shared ideas about things that are right and things that are wrong. And this manifests itself in all sorts of ways. One of the primary ones is money. We'd like to think anyways that our values correspond with the things that offer monetary benefits. But that's not necessarily the case, and that creates all sorts of other problems that I'm not going to get into right now, but yeah, that need to seek approval is a big part of the drivers behind what motivates humans to do all that they do. Then there are beliefs, and the beliefs that drive us to think about the world as, or to think about things in the world as being either good or bad. We have this kind of ingrained notion that there are certain things that are good for us, certain things that are bad for us. A lot of it stems from the roots of old religions that talk about the struggle between good and evil. But again, these are culturally instilled from the stories that we pick up along the way. The myths and mythologies that bleed into a civilization and that come to form its identity end up shaping the beliefs of the individuals in that society. And you can get such to the point where you can get where often radically different societies have opposite notions of what is good and what is bad. For example, this dragon, it might seem menacing and scary and bad to us in the West, but that's not necessarily the case. In Chinese folklore, the dragon was a very lucky sign. All of which has its roots in language. As I said before, language is a powerful driver behind all of this. It is kind of the base code on which we formalize all of these beliefs and all of these things that we think of as drivers of human motivation and human aspiration and human behavior. It's all encoded in our language in subtle ways that make it hard to tease apart, but our language forms the bedrock upon which all of these other things stand. Now, what does this have to do with medical science or Parkinson's or research in general, or the role of patients as well? Well, all of these are very important things to understand when building bridges between disparate groups of people. And we have disparate groups of people in this community. But a key part of forming those bridges is coming to an understanding the other side for what they are, and understanding what they struggle against. A lot of this was inspired by two friends of mine, Simon Stott, who runs the Science of Parkinson's website, and Mariette Robin. They first brought about this discussion, I think about 3 years ago, in a blog post that Mariette first wrote called Planet Patient versus Planet Researcher. Simon picked up on it afterwards, and they had a great exchange that I'd recommend everybody go and search for. It's a great starting point for this discussion. Now, I'm not going to be going into everything that they went into. They went into more detail than I'll have time for in this quick video, but I wanted to quickly sum up some of the things that they brought up and throw in my own points. One thing I do want to emphasize is that there's far more than just planet patient and planet scientist. There's all sorts of other quote-unquote planets that orbit around these two that influence their trajectories and that pull and tug on their paths. One in particular that I want to highlight is Planet Doctor. Now, Mariette and Simon, rightfully so, I think, in many ways, saw these different communities as occupying different worlds, different places in society. And I'm going to quickly kind of characterize each one of these, although these are very much caricatures of them. I think that what you'll see is that it comes from a superficial understanding of what it's really like to quote unquote live on that planet. So you have planet scientists. You could say that it's sparsely populated, has a rigid hierarchy, monolingual and esoteric language, so it's very hard to decipher the code that scientists say to each other, and its principal currency is recognition, often reflected in the papers that they write. Now, like I said as well, these are all kind of superficial ways of looking at these worlds. These are not how we should actually be understanding each other. What it's like to live on this planet, what it's like to spend a day in the life of a scientist. It's a very different reality, I think, from what it's perceived to be. And this is going to be the case with each of these planets. And I think what's important to realize in building these bridges is getting at the underlying motivations that drive these people to do what they do, and understanding that for the most part they're all trying to do what's in the best interests of the group as a whole. They all want to help patients at the end of the day, but they're limited in all sorts of ways. You can also take a trip to Planet Doctor. And there's some superficial ways of characterizing that as well. Some of them have some truth to them, some of them don't. The days are short. They lack the tools needed to properly do what they do. The brain is a very complex organ, and we don't have the tools needed to go in real time and assess what's going on in there. So we have to kind of work by proxy in many ways. And this limits what doctors can often do for their patients, and it also limits the kind of medications that we can build or that we can develop. Then we have Planet Patient. Planet Patient might look to be pretty densely populated, and unfortunately this is true. Its numbers are growing rapidly. It's resource scarce, it doesn't have the tools it needs to thrive, and it is seeking independence. It is seeking to become, to detach itself. I mean, the ultimate goal would be to detach itself from this solar system of sorts and allow it to live a carefree life, or allow people on Planet Patient to go back to the lives that they had prior to being a patient, prior to that first visit to their neurologist where they were first diagnosed with whatever condition they happen to be living with. Then this works. So how do these planets interact with each other? How do they orbit one another? Again, this is kind of going to be a kind of superficial way of looking at this. Maybe I should deep dive into it in a later video, but I don't have the time for that at the moment. So so the interaction often starts with a person on Planet Patient taking a trip to Planet Doctor. That's the primary bridge that connects these groups to one another. That's really the only means of connection. When a patient goes to see a doctor, that's really the only bridge that exists right now, and it exists, and it's a one-way street for the most part. Planet Science tries to help in this equation, tries to facilitate better understanding and better tools to allow Planet Doctor to better help Planet Patient. It sends all sorts of things to orbit around it. It has all sorts of tools that it tries to use to gain access to what's going on Planet Patient and to enable doctors to better help the people that they're trying to help. But the stark reality is that there's a limit to what science can do at the moment. We have these probes that, as kind of the diagram illustrates, although it's not a perfect analogy, we have these rough ways of doing it. We have MRI machines, and we have a few blood tests, and we have a few genetic tests that we can do, but they don't really strike at the core of what's going on. They don't really get it, what's going on Planet Patient. Not at the moment, anyways. Then we have another planet, Planet Indifference. This is really the rest of the world. I call them indifferent, but that's by no fault necessarily of their own. They're too busy with the rest of life to be bothered. There's a lot of problems in the world. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of problems that need addressing. There's a lot of things that need to be solved. We can't expect them to care too much about what's going on any one of these planets. But we do try to seek more of their attention. We try, obviously, this is the source of funding for a lot of the projects that go on these planets. And it's kind of a constant pull and tug to try and gain more resources from this planet. The goal, I think, is to rid ourselves of these planets and to build those bridges that we need to connect our worlds and to ensure that we have two-way communication and two-way access to one another. I think only once we all occupy the same space are we ever going to truly make the progress that patients one day will need. It's an alignment problem, and the problem is systemic. This is an all-of-society problem. In many ways, it's going to require rethinking what healthcare is, what medicine is, what the role of a doctor is, what the role of a patient is, what the role of a scientist is. I hope that ultimately one day we might get to this place. I think that's the direction we should be heading towards. That should be kind of the aim, even though it seems very far out into the future. We need to knock down as many walls that separate the groups from one another and build as many bridges as we possibly can to connect them all together, so that everyone's aligned under the same problem, and that everyone is properly motivated to do all the things that we need to do. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening.